Welcome to our second Sociology Colloquium series. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Hyunjoon Park, who's actually one of my favorite mentors and amazing person and scholar. And you will find that through one-on-one meetings or lunch gatherings, but it's just great. So I'm so delighted to introduce today's speaker, Hyunjoon Park. Hyunjoon Park received his PhD here, UW-Madison in 2005. Ever since he was part of the Penn Sociology department, he's now Korea Foundation, has been also Foundation Professor of Sociology at University of Pennsylvania. He's also director of James Jujin Kim Program in Korean Studies. We also have a director for Center for East Asian, Charles Kim here. It's actually great to have him here. Hyunjoon Park's research focuses on how contexts matter as a sociologist, specifically how schools and families affect children's education. His research interest includes education, social stratification, family and social demography, and cross-national comparative perspectives with a focus on Korea and other East Asian countries. So I try to print out all his publications, but as you know, it's kind of like, unless he has 3 books, edited volumes included, and multiple papers from Annual Review of Sociology, Social Ed, several articles in Social Ed. He has been an editor, and he published a lot in research in social stratification and mobility, demography, so the list goes on. And he's just a terrific scholar who has been super productive till now, and then is still very productive. And he's working on a new project on Korean families, really focusing on social stratification and social inequality. So without further ado, I welcome Hyunjoon Park.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to be back. I was actually in downtown last night. Things so much changed, like the new buildings, new construction, but this building didn't change though. So I was a little disappointed, but that area actually showed me this new addition, who was to be the library or something. So it seemed like there's something changed, but something remained, which is nice to actually to be back. Sometimes I get nervous to give a talk, but this is a place where I don't have to actually get nervous, because if I mess up, it's not my fault. It's all my teacher's fault who taught me in 2005. So blame them, okay? I mean, this is what they let me do it, so I don't have any problem. Okay, don't record this part because I don't want to hear the Bob and Gary and Adam actually listen to this. But okay, that's what it's about. So today I actually wanted to talk a little bit about actually the Korean family. So maybe it may not so much interest to you by itself as a Korean family, but I think there's a really interesting change happening in Korean context. And I'd like to, highlight what that change actually may mean, especially in a country where the family used to be the very strong institutions, but you will see that is actually quite rapidly, the changing over time. If you actually remember the movie Parasite, I'm sure that many of you watched. One notice about this Parasite is that even working class, the families are so tied together. Remember this Parasite, the movie, these working class parents, father, mother, son, and daughter, they work all together. Which is probably not actually the case. We're more typical, the working class parents are more vulnerable actually. The families don't talk to each other because many of them are in a good relationship. They are not even actually live together and so on. So things actually quite change, and I hope that this give us a little bit about idea about what that actually means for this family sociology and more broadly about inequality studies. This is a famous 1967 Blonde Duncan, the mother of stratification. In illustrations, the Blonde Duncan show how the parents, especially in this case, father's education and father's occupations, affect the adult children's occupational attainment through their own education and first job. So this kind of illustration gives some very basic idea about how sociologists conceptualize these parents and children's, the relationship in this, the stratification process. 1997, the Warren Hauser actually even extend this idea about 2 generations, including 3 third generation, grandparent generation. So what actually they show is that this is grandparents, and grandparents affect the grandchildren through parents. Either directly, or here is actually through the parents. Yeah, there's lots of actually the unknown, or I don't know even how to pronounce actually. This is all this, the thing. But this is about the parents, this is about grandparents, and this is grandchildren. So this again, to conceptualize how the parents and even grandparents affect the grandchildren through this kind of the three-generation relationships. In this qualitative study of the parent-children relationship, analysts actually identify different parenting style, parenting logics, and parenting practice between working class and the middle class. Even though all these studies so far assume pretty much about the two-parent family, even McLaren and Sandifer actually highlights how families are diverse in the United States. So they're no longer just focusing, assuming the two-parent family, but single-parent families, how the single-parent family has a challenge in terms of their family lives and how does it affect their children's life. So all these studies actually, they look at this issue about the parent-children's in a different way with a different focus and different interests. But they share one fundamental assumption, to my perspective. Again, regardless whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative, whether they look at the grandchildren, children's, parent-children relationship, where parents, the stratification, they share one fundamental assumption, which is they take granted the existence of family. There have to be parents, they have the grandparents in order to these things work, right? So in other words, what they're actually interested about is the which family, rather than whether or not the families, but the question is which family, either affluent families or poor families, or more involved parents families or less involved parents families, two-parent families, single-parent family. All they do is which families are more successful in intergenerational transmission. In other words, they're interested about the inequality in the quality of families, between families inequality, in other words. So that we know that this, the affluent families or more educated parent families are more successful in transmitting their advantage to the next generations. But today I'm actually wanting to switch the gears to by asking the question, in fact, who actually cannot have a family at all from the very beginning. Again, rather than asking about which families do better or do more successful in transmitting the advantage to the next generation, my question today is actually who can have a families? Because lots of increasingly, especially not only in the United States case, but lots of countries, you see that increasingly fewer people form family through the marriage. Again, you can form family in many different ways: adoptions, cohabitations, without the kid. But in relation to South Korea, where I will actually focus on today, the marriage is the most dominant way of actually forming the families. So very little cohabitations, very little actually adoptions, so that actually the marriage is pretty much still the major, probably only the dominant actually way of the forming marriage, the forming family. But if increasingly fewer people form family, that means many of them will not have families in their life. Unless you think about the families in a different way. Again, if there's cohabitation, if there's another way of forming families in South Korea, then you can imagine that this may not be that much issue, but when the marriage is a major pathway forming families and increasingly the people are not getting married, that really means that some of them will not have families. Also, increasingly fewer people keep a family once married. Yes, you can have family, but once you have family, some of them actually quickly dissolve their marriage. More interesting enough, increasingly more and more old people live alone. So the question is indeed actually now, I think the fundamental question to me is rather than, or in addition to which families actually do better, whether someone even can have a families. That's kind of the first question for today. This question is even actually more relevant and probably more extreme in South Korean context, where this old idea about strong family ties the parents and children's relationship as a key, like institutional, the factors. That's where these things become matter, and this is a kind of the irony of the trend. So let me start with this old image of Korean families. So when I ask you about, hey, what do you think about Korean families, or a broadly East Asian family, like Taiwan, China, and Japan, although probably quite different across within this East Asian context, but still broadly there shares some of the similarity too. So then, what kind of image do you have for Korean families? Again, probably the most the significant image is about the strong family ties, or like a universality of family. So in fact, the family was available to the vast majority of society, if not all. Again, we see lots of difference between families, but the fact that everyone has a family was actually kind of taken granted. Because everyone got married. As I will show you, even 1995, almost everyone got married in South Korean context. So then they actually were able to form the family. So the family was a universal. It's like a public schooling in the United States, right? Public schoolings are given. You never ask about public schooling birds. Yes, private schooling, but if you think about that, is where difference, which schools are better than others. But we never ask the question whether it's who gets the schooling. Because except a few, also the vast majority got married. This is kind of question. And once forming the families through marriage, couples tend to stay together. So there was no many couple that that deserved the families after actually getting married. Then married couples maintained close relationship with all the parents and kept their children until later age. So this is kind of typical image of Korean families or broadly East Asian family. But things change, and we never really appreciate how things quickly change, and no longer tell me that this is a Korean family, because Korean families are so much different now. So you can forget everything today, but when you leave this room, you don't tell someone else this is a Korean family. Okay, no longer this is a Korean family, because there's lots of things change. So I'd like to revisit this issue about the universal family in Korea, because is that family still universal in contemporary Korea? There's a couple of a trend that suggests that probably the family no longer is granted, or everyone actually gets family, but actually some people don't get families. So I will show the three main a trend that may suggest that families have become kind of expensive actually in contemporary Korean case, or maybe someone actually opt out not to have actually the family. So one is a women's education expansion, growing economic inequality, but continued weak public welfare system. So this is the trends of the higher education, especially who have a bachelor degree by birth court for men and women. And this is a pretty typical story, like in the U.S. and other countries where women catch up, so that by birth court 1985, there's no difference between the man and woman in terms of going to bachelor degree. By the way, in Korea, almost half of them actually BA degree. Isn't that amazing? I mean, looking at the 10% to 50% within 30, maybe 3 or 4 decades. If you're interested about social change, this is a country you gotta study. I mean, don't you agree with this kind of amazing increase of higher education? I mean, if you don't believe this is interesting, come on, it's sociology. What are we supposed to do? So this means that women by now may actually, instead of just taking the traditional law, many women now have, they can choose either stay as a careers woman or whether actually they take actually the family. Another point that I like to make is that in Korea it's very difficult to combine family and work, especially among women. So in Korea still has this kind of M-shaped pattern of the labor force participation, which is women's, lots of women work before marriage, but once for the time of the marriage and the childbearing, many of them left actually the labor force. Then they coming back when their kids actually go to school. So this kind of the M-shaped pattern of the labor force participation by age among women, no longer actually you can see in any of OECD countries except for Korea. So in this kind of context, though, still this increasing probably women's education may make them gives the opportunity to keep their careers, occupations, the work rather than the family. So family is no longer probably just like the natural, the direction, but maybe it's something that they can actually think about. Another thing is about the income inequalities. If we believe the income inequality especially hit these low-income families, this is where you see that there's much more potential about how this growing income inequality may hurt these low-income families in South Korea. There's lots of debate about the level of the inequality, but so this is a very just one estimate. So I think it's not maybe the good estimate, but still it gives a good sense of how things change over time very quickly. So this shows the top 10% income share. So by the early 90s or late 1990s, it was only about the 33%, 34%, but over the time, by 2015, it's almost like a 48%. So this is similar level to the U.S., right? Almost half of top 10% income go to the top 10% in the United States. So if you think about U.S. is like an inequality country, but Korea is almost like that kind of level now as compared to even just 20 years ago. So things quite change quickly, and maybe this growing income inequality again hurt these low-income families probably more than the top-income families. But despite of this growing income inequality, Korea continued to have very weak welfare system. So this is a public expenditure on family as a percentage of GDP. And as you can see, the Korea is like the only 1.2% of their GDP spent on family as a publicly, which is actually the lower than many of OECD countries, except probably if you always think about these issues at Japan and Korea and United States to some extent. Although here, where's the United States? Yeah, here even worse than Korea. So yes, always the Korea, Japan, and U.S. go together for the this kind of indicator. But this kind of the welfare state, the weak welfare state also indicate that this growing income inequality, if they hurt actually, so especially low-income family, it will actually give much more burden to the actual family because there's no public support actually for this, the family. So these are the kind of again the three trends that I think this is no longer the family is given, but somewhat some of the groups in Korean context actually start to get more family than others, and this is where my talk actually will focus today. Over this time, there's lots of things that changed in South Korea, so that actually increasingly the marriage rate has declined, divorce rate has increased, and the percentage of people living alone has increased. But all this family change didn't happen to everyone in the same degree. Probably this happens more so for some other groups. So the question is whether this family change happened to this more, the people with more resource, and what does that mean that these divergent trends of the family behaviors between these highly educated and low educated folks. Although I can use some income measure too to look at this, the high class and low class, because I use actually so many different data sets, I actually end up with using educational attainments as a key factor for social mobility, especially in the contemporary Korea. So that by looking at the highly educated folks and the low educated folks, first major family behaviors, you will see that's how these trends indicate availability for family for different groups. So in this talk, I'd like to actually talk a little bit about this educational divide and its trends over time in the likelihood of having or not having family. Again, I actually focus the family only through the marriage. It's not because there's no other way, but in South Korean context, it's very difficult to have the family without marriage. Again, the cohabitations and adoptions and all other practices are very rarely practiced in Korean context, so that marriage is the dominant way of family formation. So I'd like to see how this marriage trends are different between the highly educated and low educated folks. But once the people form the family, what about the family dissolution? So who are more to get divorced? Is it highly educated folks or low educated folks? Finally, I'd like to share a little bit about who live alone. Again, this whole image that the Korean parents, all the parents who are taking care of their children, that seemed like a really not working. Obviously, I don't take care of my parents because I'm here and my parents are in South Korea. But Even if I was in Korea, probably it's a different story now, So that this, the who lives alone among the elderly is actually really give a clear indication to me at that in the where the Korean family is moving. So I actually like to share this part. So that in these three different family behavior, I like to highlight the difference across individuals of varying level of education, especially less than high school, some college, and four-year university. But I like to focus on this top and bottom category of education, so that how these three different family, the trend diverge over time in Korean context. And the end of the story is that family has become very expensive and has become luxury. So it's no longer is a given to everyone, but only someone can get these families, but not others. So that's kind of the bottom line of the my talk. So now you can sleep, because I already talked about all these things. So let's talking about the family formation through marriage and its education to buy. So the question is, do the low educated face more challenging in forming a family through marriage than the highly educated? Even in 1995, this graph showed that percentage of 40 to 40 years old who are ever married. So what do you see here? Everyone got married, right? Pretty much. Yeah, 2%, 3% probably remained single. But even 1995, I mean, I don't have the corresponding figure for the United States, but this graph really tells us about, yes, this old image of the universe family was true in old days, even 1995. Because almost more than 95% of men and women, regardless of education, got married ever by age 40 to 44 years old. What about the educational difference? Very small, right? Because everyone got married. If there's any, probably there's some positive relationship a little bit, so that the man with the 4 years college is probably a little more likely to get married by age 40 to 44. They delay marriage, but eventually by age 40 and 44, they are more likely to get married because they have resource. For women, though, if there's any, probably a little bit even more stronger than actually men, which is a negative relationship. So Korean women did not get married as much. The college-educated woman did not get married as much as women without college degree. But again, this difference is very small, right? In 1995, what happened after 20 years? Just 2 decades. I was here 2 decades ago. Seriously, that's kind of the short timeline. Korea is a lovely country, isn't it? I mean, look at this. Okay. Especially for high school, the man without high school degree, now almost 95 to only half of them just get married ever by age 40 to 44. Yes, this proportion actually now is a very small, tiny. That is true because expansion of education. This part actually in terms of share of population is very small. But if you actually look at the high school, which actually quite substantial percent is still there, still they are the ones who actually see the larger decline in the proportion of marriage as compared to highly educated men. If you high school graduate in South Korea, only 7 of 10 will get married eventually by age 40 and 44. We assume that there's not much action going on after age 44. That means 3 out of 10 among the high school graduates will remain single forever. Yes?
Just a clarification, is this ever married? Oh, is it a...
The ever married, right,
so
right.
Divorce
Ever,
before, okay.
Right, so include the divorce as of now,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
divorce and the widow. But again, at the time, the divorce is actually increasing, but but still is ever married. For women, too, I mean the decline. But interesting enough that this low educated woman especially showed the largest decline too. Although in a woman's case, it's a highly educated woman also declined as much as the low educated woman. So the woman's pattern is more bimodal, but for the man's case, as you can clearly see that this is the low educated man whose chance of getting married is dramatically declined over this 20 years point. You may not still see this, how this is a really dramatic change over 20 years. So let me switch the same finding using the cohort perspective rather than period. This is a period. So what I did is, I look at the basically the proportion of Korean men who remain single, unmarried by age So that this is the age, and this is the the decline in proportion of the men who remain single by age, education, and cohort. So I pick up the old cohort, 1946 to 55 were born, and three, I have some college too, but because the lines are many, so I just look at the three, different groups. So which is less than high school, and university. So I just walk through you so that you can see what this graph would mean. So by, for those college graduate, right? You can see by age like 29, 50 of them actually will already remain single. Are you with me? Yeah? This is how I read. So what they actually show is that these college-educated men actually delay marriage. So that actually many of them remain single as more than these two lines. But eventually by age 31, 32, there was actually crossover. So that if you look at by 39, actually this college-educated men's actually lower percentage of them remain single. In other words, they are more likely to get married by age 39, which is exactly the same as we just saw in the period graph, right? But the gap is almost tiny there, right? That means that even though these college-educated men delay marriage, eventually they are more likely to get married, but the educational difference was very tiny in old days. Are you with me? Yeah, that's what the graphs actually show. Even here, the same in this kind of in 1995 situation. But after 20 years later, who were born in 1965 to 75, this is what happened. This is $1 million graph. I spent so much time to think about this graph. So what is actually over this whole line actually go up? That means many of them remain single more than in the past, right? So there's much delay and much less likely to get married among those new cohort. But the important point is that the gap between this low educated, highly educated, diverges. Much larger degree, right? So now if you actually have less than high school education, again, only 40% of them actually, 60 of them actually will eventually get married by age 39. So this graph and previous graph by the period, the perspective, tells the very same story that it is, yes, there's a decline in marriage rate and people delay and even probably more likely remain as a single, but that trend is much more substantially, the substantial in the degree and the magnitude among the low educated folk. So, in terms of the family formation, the rapid decline in marriage is more evident among the low educated than the highly educated. So the marriage is increasingly difficult to achieve among those least educated. So again, almost half of them will never get married in their life if this trend it continue. So only for those highly educated men, 70% of them will get actually married by age 40 to 44. So this is where you see that the family formation through the marriage is happening more for some group, but then not other groups. So let's assume that you somehow get married. Let's say even if you're a high school graduate, you pass these odds of getting not married. Luckily you got married. Then whether you keep your family. So this is the next question about the family dissolutions. So the question is, are the low educated less likely to keep the tie than the higher educated? Again, the point is that they are less likely to get married, right? That's what we see. But once they get married, what happened? So if actually this group don't show any difference in terms of the divorce, then maybe there's some different, the policy that to include, their marriage chance. But if actually they even show there's an increased divorce rate, then that's kind of the more complicated, the story and policy implication. So what you can see is that, interesting enough, actually there's a similar diverging by education in terms of the divorce rate. So this is a divorce rate, number of divorces divided by the married people. So in 1995, yes, there's a little actually difference between the college educated and non-college educated, but the gap has really diverging, and particularly among those less than high school educated. So if you don't have a high school education or you have a high school education, the story is you're less likely to get married, but even if you get married, you're much more likely to get divorced. And this divorce rate actually increases very similar for women too. again, this is the kind of the period perspective. So I actually shares another perspective by cohort so that we can actually look up. So this is a proportion of marriage ending within 4 years of marriage by marriage cohort. So for those who married 1993, almost 10% of those married men, this is a woman without the college degree. I think this is I forgot the legend, but this is a lowest educated woman. Was about 10% of them will actually deserve their marriage within 4 years. But that actually percentage increased. So for those who are married by 2002, almost 25% of them get divorced within 4 years of marriage. As compared to this college-educated woman, where this divorce rate has not actually changed at all. So the gap now in terms of the divorce rate between the highly educated and low educated has diverged over time. 25% within 4 years of marriage, that is not actually a small number if you think about it, indeed. So this is a pretty high actually divorce rate by now is among these low educated. Although again, I have to acknowledge that this number has very small, increasingly small because of the education expansion. So this is kind of the big question about how we actually make sense of this changing educational composition. I mean, that will come back later, but this is something that we'll keep in mind, but still within the same category, as you can see, this, the divorce, the educational divide in divorce has diverged over time. So that rapid increase in divorce is more evident for the low educated than the high educated. So it is increasingly difficult for the low educated to maintain marriage relatively to their highly educated counterpart. Remember again, the low educated have increasingly difficulty to form families through marriage, but even if they lucky enough to get family, but they're still much more likely to, difficult to maintain their families. So once they get divorced, then what happened? Like in the old days in Korea, when women get divorced, they actually go back to their parents, their own parent families. Because again, there's no strong welfare system, so it was very hard actually for single parent women to live themselves with their kids. So what the typical way of doing is they going back to their parent. So the parents actually, their parents tend to live with their children and so on. But these things also change over time. But I will not actually have time to show that particular group of a single parent family and how their living arrangement has changed over time. But rather, I would like to show how this living alone, the share of the living alone among elderly people has changed over time differently for different education groups. So living alone is actually quite a difficult phenomenon, whether it's by choice, whether it's by force, like a constraint. This is a lot of the question actually remain, but I don't want to go too deeply, but just barely just showing the trends of the living alone by different education group, we actually see the very consistent actually the trend. So this is a percentage of Korean women who lived alone by age and year. So these young folks, 1824, they will increase, but not much going on actually. But look at this group, which is a 65 plus. So among those 65 years old or older women, now in Korea almost 30% of them live alone. Not without husband even, just live alone because some of their husband die or they just don't live with their kid. 30% of these women live alone. But if we actually limit our interest to the 65 widowed only, who are typically assumed by taking care of their children in the same household. This is what the image of the Korean family. Or if not the same family, next family, the next household. You live in next house or upstairs and downstairs. So I don't actually look at where to live. I mean, that's another interesting the phenomena. But this is just simply whether they live together or not. And among the 65 widow, almost half of them live alone. Okay, where are those kids? Those kids don't live with their parents actually. But then more interesting is who are more likely to live alone? Is it highly educated elderly folks or is it lowly educated folks? So this line is less than elementary school because that's the lowest level of education among the elderly. Then this is elementary, middle school, high school, or more. So what do you see? Yes, over the time, everyone's increased their likelihood of living alone over time from 1980 to 2010, but especially among lowest educated elderly folks. It is not the highly educated folks, but it is actually low educated elderly population. So in other words, okay, extreme way, I mean, I didn't look at this carefully, but if you don't have money, your kids will not live with you. This is what this tells us. Only if you have money, then your children will live with you. Okay, I make a little, the actually bigger statement than actually what this graph tells. But if I actually dig into, actually, I actually clearly see that is the case, where if you want to live with your children as an elderly at 65, then you have to have money. Otherwise, your children will not stay with you. Is that Korean family? Yes, this is a Korean family. So let me kind of, to summarize what I've been doing here so that, I can open up actually some discussion, because I know that you have lots of questions, right? I mean, some of you don't believe this number, or some of you think it may be a different way. So I love to hear. But rapid change in family behavior in South Korea across very, many aspects of family life. Again, besides my talk on family behavior, I really like to encourage you to think about Korea as a kind of your potential study case, because it really gives lots of rapid change in many aspects: education, aging, the family behaviors, you name it. Every single indicator tells us that there's the largest change within these 2 and 3 decades. So if you're interested about the social change, it is a country that everyone has to study. So let's meet up next year in the International Conference Sociology of Korea. So this trend of family behavior have occurred for both low educated and highly educated. Indeed, as you can see, this marriage decline happened both highly educated and low educated. I do not deny that this is only happening, it doesn't happen to highly educated. It happened to everyone. But educational differential in family behavior have diverged over time, so that these low educated are increasingly less likely to form a family through marriage, are increasingly more likely to end a marriage once they start marriage, receive less support from family, particularly when they need. So in other words, I didn't actually show here about the exchange of the family support, but only looking at the living arrangement. But still, I see the very similar pattern when I look at the exchange of the support within the family, as well. So is the family available for everyone in contemporary South Korea? Certainly no. Family has become a luxury, in my argument, for the low educated in the contemporary Korea. So that it's increasingly difficult to achieve the family through marriage. Even if married, low educated are much more likely to join marriage. When need, family support is not available for you if you don't have money, if you don't have a higher education. So this is my argument about how Korean family has become luxury. Thank you.